I thought everyone had given up on me. That was the first thing Marcus noticed when he saw her standing in the doorway of Frost and Ember Café on that cold Saturday morning in January. It was written in the way her shoulders curved inward, the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when the third table in a row turned away from her. Her name was Sophie, though Marcus didn't know that yet. He only knew that he recognized something in her, a familiar flavor of invisible. Marcus Carter had been learning about invisibility for 6 years. He sat at the second table from the window, the corner one that caught the morning light perfectly, and stayed warm, away from the draft that seeped through the glass on days like this. David, his 6-year-old son, sat across from him with his legs swinging and his mouth surrounded by the foam of a hot chocolate that he took very seriously. This was their ritual. Every Saturday at 9:15, without exception, they came to Frost and Ember, not because the coffee was exceptional. It was adequate. Not because the pastries were remarkable. They were good, but nothing more. They came because ritual was how you told a child that tomorrow you would show up again. Tomorrow the world would not feel quite so unstable. It was a promise Marcus made without words. 6 years ago, before David was born, before Claire got sick, before the word widow became Marcus's primary identity, Saturdays had meant something different. They had meant sleeping late pancakes with burnt edges, that Claire loved lazy hours without obligation. But that Marcus was gone. The man who existed now was someone else entirely, someone who understood that ritual was the only thing between a small boy and the knowledge that people disappear. The morning had started like all Saturday mornings did. Marcus woke before his alarm, a habit his body had learned over years of anticipating tears in the dark. He made coffee while David slept, reviewing the day's requirements in his head. Permission slip signed backpack-packed outfit that didn't require wrestling. He stood at the kitchen window and watched snow fall on the street below, and he thought about Claire, who had loved snow. She used to open the windows in winter just to smell it, just to feel the cold edge of it against her skin. That was before the diagnosis, before everything changed. David woke at 7, which was early for a Saturday, but ideal for their ritual. Marcus dressed him in warm clothes without rushing, buckled the small coat that always seemed both too big and too small at the same time, and asked if David was ready for their adventure. David always said yes. He didn't understand that it wasn't adventure exactly. It was survival presented as ritual. They walked the 8 blocks to Frost and Ember, in the cold air that made the whole city feel muffled and slowed. Snow crunched under their boots. David's yellow scarf, the one he'd insisted on despite it clashing with everything he owned, flapped behind him like a flag. They didn't talk much. That was part of the ritual, too. They just moved through the quiet morning together. Carmen was already there when they arrived, setting up tables with the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered. She was 28 and had worked the Saturday morning shift for 3 years, and she always saved their table without being asked. James, the manager, was in the back, making espresso. The smell of it filled the cafe like a benediction. The other regulars were starting to arrive, the man in the red coat, who everyone called the Penguin, the old woman who read the same page of her book every week, the tourist couple who came back every January and sat in the same spot, confused by routine they didn't understand. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was exactly as it had been, which meant tomorrow it would be exactly the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. Predictability was how Marcus kept the world from falling apart. David ordered hot chocolate with very specific requirements that Carmen knew by heart. A little less milk, 2 tablespoons of chocolate syrup, the kind with the marshmallows that didn't dissolve too fast. Marcus ordered black coffee he wouldn't finish. They settled at the table and David opened his book and began reading with the enormous seriousness of a child who took his hobbies very seriously. That was when the bell above the door rang. Everyone looked up. People always did when the door opened, that small Pavlovian response to sound and cold air. Sophie entered with snow on her shoulders and a gray wool coat that looked like it came from a warmer city, one that didn't understand what winter could do. Her left arm moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had learned to occupy space despite the world's instinct to make room in the worst way by looking away. The metal of her forearm crutch was bright under the cafe's warm lighting, and her right leg was steady on the ground, while her left one ended just below the knee, replaced by the precise geometry of a prosthetic that she carried beneath dark jeans like a secret she was tired of keeping. She was young, early 20s maybe, with pale skin gone pink from the cold and dark hair that the wind had tangled into something that looked like she'd been fighting. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she was looking around the cafe with the quiet desperation of someone who had been outside for too long and needed very badly to sit down. The cafe was nearly full. Marcus watched her eyes move from table to table. He watched the first table, the young couple on a date shift in their chairs, and suddenly become very interested in their coffee cups. He watched the second table, a man and woman who might have been friends or colleagues, glance up and then deliberately look away, reaching for phones, remembering urgent business. He watched the third table, a woman alone, make eye contact, and then turn her body slightly unconsciously. The small reflexive contraction of a person who doesn't want to have to do the thing they know would be the right thing to do. Sophie's jaw tightened. She straightened her shoulders. She moved through the cafe, with quiet expertise, navigating with a precision that came from practice. And each time she paused near a table, she got the same response. A slight turning away, a reaching for a phone, an averted gaze. She stopped in the middle of the cafe for just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Her eyes were very dark and very steady, and she looked in that moment like a person who was extremely practiced at not letting anyone see what something cost her. But Marcus saw it. He had spent 6 years watching David's face in the dark of his bedroom when his son thought he was alone. He had learned in that long education how to read the small distances between what a face showed and what it was feeling. He saw what it cost her. He saw the weight of rejection, not because it was new, but because it was relentless, because it was everywhere, because it had become the white noise of her existence. He stood up. David looked up from his book where he had been reading for longer than his usual 4 minutes a record. He watched his father push back his chair. Sophie had already started moving again toward the counter, probably to ask if there was anything available, probably knowing there wasn't. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had made peace with asking for things in public and had made an equal peace with being refused. Marcus said, "Excuse me." She turned. Her eyes were dark brown, slightly red at the corners from the cold or from something else. She had a small, precise scar along her left jawline that disappeared into the collar of her coat. There was something in her face that suggested she was very tired of being looked at as a problem that needed solving. Marcus said, "You're welcome to sit with us. There's plenty of room." The entire cafe stopped. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not the kind with music swelling or slow motion. It was just a man inviting a woman to join his table, something that should have been ordinary, something that should have required no courage at all. But the room understood what had happened. The silence that followed was not comfortable silence. It was the silence of people watching someone defy an invisible rule, watching someone treat a stranger like she deserved to exist in public space without proving her worth. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, not suspiciously, not with the cautious assessment of someone wondering about motive, more like someone who had been spoken to kindly, in a language they had almost forgotten they knew, and needed a moment to translate the words. "Are you sure?" she said. And Marcus, who had learned that certainty was a luxury he couldn't afford, who understood the weight of what he was offering, said, "Not just share. You're welcome here." And he meant it simply, without performance, just a fact he was stating about how things were going to be from this moment forward. The cafe was not silent anymore, but the people nearest to them had gone quiet, in the way people go quiet when they are listening, when they are watching something important happen, and they don't quite understand why it matters, but they know that it does. Sophie sat down. The relief in her body was immediate, almost involuntary. She set her bag down carefully and unwound her scarf, revealing a small frame that seemed to carry much larger weight. "I'm Sophie," she said. Marcus extended his hand. "I'm Marcus, and this is David." His son was looking at Sophie with open, unself-conscious curiosity, the way children look at the world before they learn to look away. David put down his book with great dignity. "I'm 6, he said, "almost 7. "What's your name again?" "Elena," Sophie said, and then smiled, the kind of real smile that changes a face entirely. That, she said, is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a while. The hot chocolate arrived. Sophie ordered black tea and wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her palms. David explained to Sophie with considerable detail why their Saturday ritual was important, how they came here every week without exception, how his dad said it was sacred, but then corrected himself and said ritual, and Sophie listened like what he was saying mattered. Like a 6-year-old's observations about the world deserved genuine attention. They sat together at the second table from the window, while the snow fell outside and the cafe slowly returned to its normal operations. But something had shifted. People who had refused Sophie were ordering more coffee, staying longer. Not because they suddenly understood disability, not because they had a moral awakening, but because they had just been shown by a quiet man and a small child what kindness actually looked like. And it was harder to look away from that than to look away from a girl with a crutch. That was the moment. That was when everything changed. Sophie didn't know it yet, but she was about to learn that she was allowed to exist. She was about to learn that being seen didn't have to hurt. Marcus didn't know it yet, but he was about to remember what it felt like to want something instead of just endure something. And David, unknowingly, was about to teach both of them that acceptance didn't require understanding, just presence. The second table from the window became the most important table in the cafe, and on every Saturday after that, it was occupied by exactly the right people. For the first month, Sophie wasn't sure if it was real. She would wake on Saturday mornings and think about calling, about canceling, about protecting herself from the inevitable moment when Marcus would change his mind, or when she would do something wrong, or when he would finally understand the true weight of what he'd offered. But then she would remember David's voice asking if she was coming back, and she would get ready and she would show up. The second Saturday was the hardest. Sophie stood outside the cafe for 10 minutes, hand on the door, afraid to open it. What if last week was exception? What if today Marcus had changed his mind? What if she'd misunderstood everything, and this was all a setup for a different kind of cruelty? But then, Carmen saw her through the window and waved, and Marcus and David were already at their table, and David's face lit up when he saw her, and something inside Sophie released a tension she didn't know she'd been carrying. That became the pattern. Every Saturday, the same table, the same ritual, the same question asked by David. Will you come back? And Sophie, every single time, said yes. The third Saturday, Marcus asked if she needed help getting to the bus stop. Fourth Saturday, he walked her there without offering, just moved with her at her pace. Sixth Saturday, David asked if Sophie had a favorite color, and Sophie said green, and David told her about a frog at the Natural History Museum that was the same color, and she should come see it sometime. Sometime became a specific Sunday in late February. Marcus took Sophie and David to the museum. Sophie hadn't been outside in weeks, except for the walk to the cafe. She'd been in her apartment, in her job, in the small spaces she'd carved out for herself, where she didn't have to see people flinch. The museum was overwhelming in the best way, so much life, so much wonder, so much evidence that the world continued on regardless of what anyone thought about her leg. David showed her the frog. It was exactly the color of the green shoes Sophie decided to buy 3 weeks later, shoes that David said made her look like a herpist, which is what he'd decided he might become, or maybe a systems engineer, or both, because his dad said, you could be anything twice. In the early afternoon of a day when the sunlight slanted through the cafe windows in a particular way that made everything look golden, Marcus and Sophie sat alone because David was in a birthday party. They were quiet for a long moment. Then Marcus said, I wanted to make sure you'd come back. And Sophie understood that he wasn't talking about that day. He was talking about all of it, about whether she would stay, about whether she believed him. I wasn't sure I should, she said. Why not? Because good moments like this, they end. They always do. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Not just share. You're welcome here every Saturday, he said again, like it needed repeating, like she needed to hear it more than once. And if Saturday stops working, then Thursday, or Wednesday morning, or whenever. But you're welcome here, Sophie. Full stop. No conditions, no asterisks, just welcome. Sophie's eyes filled with water. She didn't know what to say. Nobody had ever offered non-conditional space before. Her parents loved her in the way parents who didn't know how to show it love, with concern that felt like criticism. Her friends had disappeared after the accident, not from cruelty, but from discomfort, which sometimes felt worse, because at least cruelty was easy to hate. Why did you do it? She asked. Last week at the cafe, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know what it's like to be the person nobody makes room for. I'm a single dad. People are kind but afraid. I'm invisible in a different way than you are, but I know the feeling. Sophie nodded. She understood. She understood that they were not helper and helped. They were two people who understood the weight of invisibility from different angles. Over the next 2 months, Sophie became part of the ritual. Every Saturday was followed by some small adventure. A walk to the park in early March when the snow was turning to slush. A trip to the library where David picked out books about every subject he was currently interested in, which changed every week. A Sunday afternoon where Sophie sat in Marcus's apartment for the first time and learned that it was small and loved, filled with David's drawings and Claire's memory, which was woven through everything like a color no one talked about, but everyone could see. It was during one of these Sundays that Sophie met Marcus's friend Derek, who worked with him at the marketing firm. Derek said, in the way that people said things they thought were kind, "You must be the girl Marcus is helping. Good guy, Marcus. Takes real character to do that." Sophie smiled and said nothing, but Marcus, overhearing, said something sharp that made Derek uncomfortable. Afterwards, Sophie and Marcus sat on his small couch while David was asleep, and Marcus said, "I'm sorry. I hate when people talk about you like you're a charity case." It was the first opening for a real conversation about what was happening between them. Sophie said, "What am I then? Because sometimes I can't tell if you want me here or if you want to be the kind of man who helps." And Marcus, without any of the false certainty that usually protected him, said, "I want you here. Not because of anything you are or anything you've overcome, because I like talking to you, because my kid adores you, because you make the world feel smaller and safer, but I understand why you'd worry about that, why you'd think maybe I'd change my mind." They didn't touch that night, but something shifted. Something moved from possibility to probability. Then in April, Sophie's mother called. Miranda hadn't seen her daughter in 8 months. The visit was both unexpected and inevitable. Sophie found herself explaining where she was going when she got ready for Saturday's café trip, and her mother asked who she was meeting, and everything went wrong from there. "He's not taking advantage, is he?" her mother said, and the way she said it made clear that she couldn't imagine any reason a man would want to spend time with her daughter, except pity or something darker. "Mom," Sophie said carefully, "he has a son. We're just friends." But her mother's doubt had planted itself. Sophie spent that Saturday in a fog, and Marcus noticed immediately. When David went to the bathroom, Marcus asked what happened, and Sophie didn't want to tell him, but did anyway. "I wonder if you actually want me here, or if you're just being nice. I wonder if my mom's right, and you're going to wake up one day and realize you don't actually want this complicated thing in your life." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. Then what he said. "What would I do? I'd leave," Sophie said, "like everyone else. Then I'd tell you," Marcus said. "But that's not happening. Sophie, you're not a project. You're not charity. You're someone I choose to spend Saturdays with, just like I choose to spend Saturdays with David. It's not obligation. It's want." They were quiet. Then David came back, and the moment passed, but something was resolved. Sophie understood that Marcus meant it. And more than that, she understood that she was allowed to want something too. May brought a kind of integration that Sophie didn't know how to name. She started coming to the cafe on Tuesday evenings, sometimes, not just Saturdays. She started sitting with Marcus and David at his small apartment, helping David with homework, cooking dinner with Marcus while they talked about nothing important and everything essential. One Saturday after hot chocolate, David asked Sophie, "Do you ever not come?" Sophie understood that he was asking something bigger. Will you always be here? Because people who matter should be here. David said matter of fact, in the way children could be stating simple truths that took adults years to understand. Yeah, David, Sophie said, I'm going to be here. Not because I have to, but because I want to. At the end of May, Marcus suggested a walk through Central Park. David ran ahead, and Marcus and Sophie walked slowly hand in hand. They didn't talk about what was happening. They just walked, and the spring was moving towards summer, and everything felt possible in a way that was almost frightening. Then in June, everything almost fell apart. David came home from school different. A distance had opened between him and Sophie that hadn't been there before. She picked him up one afternoon, and his friends were there, and David said in the bright, casual way he had when he was being cool, "That's my dad's girlfriend." Sophie felt the words like a physical thing, not girlfriend, not friend, not someone defined by her own existence, but by her relationship to someone else. She was becoming an appendage again, defined by what she was to someone else instead of who she was. She dropped David off at Marcus's apartment that evening and said she needed to go home. Marcus asked what happened, and she couldn't explain without sounding ridiculous, without sounding like she was punishing a 6-year-old for a linguistic choice that he didn't understand. But that night alone in her apartment, Sophie spiraled. What if she was fooling herself? What if Marcus did see her as a project? What if the moment he realized how much work she was, how much space she took up, he would disappear? She texted Marcus, "I can't come Saturday." When he called, she almost didn't answer, but she did, and he said, "Talk to me. What if I'm too much?" Too much what? Too complicated, too broken. What if you realize you don't actually want this? Marcus was quiet. Then he said, "Then I'd tell you. But that's not happening. Sophie, you're not a project. You're someone I choose. Every single day I choose you." And David, he's learning how to love someone. That's messy and complicated, and sometimes he'll say things wrong, but it doesn't mean he doesn't mean it. Sophie came to the cafe the next Saturday. David was visibly relieved. He said in the serious way he had, "I'm sorry I said you were just my dad's girlfriend. You're like my mom. You're like my person." And something in Sophie healed. July was when Marcus began to understand what he felt. His colleague Derek said something thoughtless at work. Something about having patience for what Sophie was, what she represented. And Marcus, who usually let things slide, found himself standing up and saying, "She's not a burden. She's the person I love. I don't love her, despite her disability. I love her full stop. Lily just happens to be part of my life." He came home angry not at Sophie, but at the world that still saw her as less than as a burden, as someone for whom kindness was exceptional rather than normal. That night, after David was asleep, Sophie and Marcus sat on the couch, and Marcus said, "I need to tell you something," without softening it. He told her what Derek said. He told her how he responded. He told her that he loved her, not because of anything she was or anything she'd overcome, but because she was Sophie. "I'm scared," he said. "If we make this permanent, if I ask you to move in, if I make this official, I'm scared I'll fail you. I'm scared I'll be the person who saves the day until the real test comes." Sophie's heart broke and repaired itself simultaneously. She asked, "What's the real test?" "When my grief comes back," Marcus said. "When I miss Claire so much I can't breathe. When I fail David. When I'm not the man who invites you to his table, but just a broken man, trying to put his life back together. "Will you stay?" Sophie said. "I'm terrified too. I'm terrified that you'll wake up and realize I'm limiting, that you and David could do so much more without me, that I'm the thing holding you back." Marcus pulled her close. "Then let's be terrified together. That's what real love is, right? Not certainty. Just choosing to stay even when it's scary." He didn't have a ring. He pulled out a key instead. "Move in," he said. "Officially. Be David's family, not just Saturday person. Be my family. And I'll spend every single day proving you chose right." Sophie said yes, not because she was certain, but because she was ready to be uncertain with someone else. August brought the integration of full commitment. Sophie moved into Marcus's apartment. She donated her lease. She put her things in drawers and hung her clothes beside Marcus's clothes, and thought about what it meant to have a place that was hers, because someone had invited her there and asked her to stay. But the world hadn't caught up with her internal transformation. One evening, they went to dinner as a family. David was excited, chattering about school, about the book he was reading, about the girl in his class who made him nervous. Sophie was quiet, and Marcus noticed immediately the way he always did. When they were seated, a server approached the table. Looking at Marcus, she said, "And what will she have?" Sophie and Marcus locked eyes. Something happened in that moment. Marcus stood up. "She's right there," he said calmly, but with steel underneath. "You can ask her." The server apologized. Sophie ordered the salmon. But the moment replayed itself in Sophie's mind long after the meal was over. In the car on the way home, Sophie said, Wife Marcus glanced at her confused. Then he realized what he'd said. In the restaurant defending Sophie's right to order her own meal, he'd said, "My wife is disabled but perfectly capable." I didn't mean to assume, he said. "We haven't even... Ask me." Sophie interrupted. "Ask me properly, but not because you're angry at the server. Ask me because you want to spend forever with me." Marcus pulled over. Right there on the side of the road, he pulled over. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a plan. He said, "Sophie, will you marry me?" And Sophie, who had waited her whole life to be asked for something, instead of offered help, said yes. From the back seat, David said, "Does this mean she's officially my mom?" Sophie turned around. "If you want that," she said. "I've wanted that for months," David said. August became September, and the reality of what they were building started to show in unexpected ways. They went back to Frost and Ember for their first Saturday as an engaged couple. Carmen, who had watched this whole story unfold from behind the counter, had organized something small. She'd made a plaque for their table. It read, "Reserved for the table where everyone belongs," with their names, with the date. Sophie cried. Not sad crying, but something deeper. Carmen and James, the manager, both approached their table. Carmen said, "You changed this place. You showed us that kindness isn't charity. It's just paying attention." Other regulars came over. The woman who'd turned away that first day approached Sophie and said, "I'm sorry. For that day, I was afraid. You made me braver." This was not redemption. The woman wasn't suddenly transformed, but she was acknowledging the role she'd played and acknowledging the bravery it took to change. That night, Sophie and Marcus sat in his apartment, David asleep, and Sophie said, "You changed the world." Marcus shook his head. I just pulled out a chair. Exactly, Sophie said. October brought a season change that felt symbolic. The leaves turned golden and red. The cafe changed its decorations. Life moved forward. Sophie completed her engineering degree, the one she'd abandoned after the accident. Her mother came to graduation. They didn't have a tearful reconciliation, but something shifted. Miranda said, "I'm proud of you." And Sophie said, "I know." And they both understood that they were finding their way towards something that looked like peace. November was quiet and full. Marcus started mentoring young single parents at a community center. He didn't talk about why didn't perform the reason. He just showed up and listened and helped them understand that being broken didn't mean you couldn't help someone else. Sophie sometimes came with him and talked about disability, about visibility, about what it meant to be seen as a full person instead of a tragedy. December brought winter back to the city. 1 year after the morning, Sophie walked into frost, and ember snow fell again. It was the same kind of snow, the kind that made the whole city feel muffled and slowed. Marcus, Sophie, and David went to the cafe on Saturday morning, and their table was waiting. Carmen came over with a small chocolate cupcake and a candle. She said, "We keep these now specifically for this day." It felt like it warranted a standing reservation. David sang happy birthday to Sophie completely off-key and completely sincere. The whole cafe joined in, not because they were performing kindness anymore, but because they had learned something about what belonging meant. Sophie blew out the candle. Lily asked, "What did you wish for?" Sophie looked at the table, at Marcus, at David, at the cafe that had become her home. "I wished for more of this," she said. David nodded seriously. "Good wish," he said. That night, Sophie and Marcus made love with all the vulnerability that comes with truly being seen. They didn't talk. They just moved together, and it felt like coming home. For the first time since the accident, Sophie wasn't thinking about her leg. She was thinking about the man who loved her, the child who'd decided she was family, the life that was no longer a survival mechanism, but an actual life. On the year anniversary date, Marcus couldn't sleep. He got up at 3 in the morning and went to the kitchen. He made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table they'd bought together and thought about everything that had happened in 12 months. He thought about the moment he stood up, about the silence that followed, about the way Sophie's face had changed when she understood she was welcome. He thought about the risks they'd taken, about the conflicts that had nearly broken them, about the moments when Sophie was sure he'd leave when Marcus was sure he'd fail. He thought about the fact that all of it hinged on one moment, on a choice he'd made without thinking, on a kindness that shouldn't have felt revolutionary, but somehow did. He wondered how many Sophies had walked into cafes and been turned away, how many Marcuses had seen someone hurting and been too afraid to stand up, how many Davids grew up learning that you don't make room for people who are different. But then he remembered the woman at the cafe who apologized, the colleague Derek who had to sit with his own prejudice, the way the whole community had shifted just a little, just enough toward understanding that kindness was not charity, but basic human decency. He thought about how the world wasn't going to change overnight. He thought about how there was still so much prejudice, so much fear, so much inability to see people as whole when they didn't fit the expected shape. But he also thought about how one person pulling out a chair, one person saying, "You're welcome here," could change everything. Not for the whole world, but for one person. And maybe that was enough. He heard Sophie wake up. heard her footsteps, felt her before he saw her. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and took his coffee cup and drank from it. "Can't sleep either," she said. Marcus shook his head. "I was thinking about how we got here." Sophie was quiet. Then she said, "Do you remember what you said?" "That first day, yeah," Marcus said. "You're welcome here. I spent months thinking you meant welcome at the table," Sophie said. "But you meant something bigger." "I meant welcome to be family," Marcus said. "I know now," Sophie said, "and I'll spend forever being grateful you saw me." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "But I'm going to ask you something," he said. "Promise me we'll fight. Promise me it won't be easy. Promise me that when you miss being whole, when you're angry about the accident, when you're frustrated with the world, you'll tell me. And promise me that I get to fail sometimes, that I get to be broken, that you won't leave because I'm not perfect." Sophie squeezed his hand. "I promise," she said. "And Marcus, promise me something too. Anything. Promise me we'll do this forever. Not because it's easy or because we're certain, but because we choose to. Every single day, we choose to show up for each other." Marcus said, "I promise." And then they sat together while the city slept, and the promise hung between them, like something real and tangible and true. 2 weeks later, they got married. Not at the café, though Carmen wanted to host it there. Not with a big ceremony, though Marcus's family offered. They went to City Hall on a Tuesday with David and Sophie, wore a dress that Marcus said made her look like herself, and David wore a suit that was too big because he was still growing, and they said their vows in front of a judge who'd seen 1,000 of these and still managed to make it feel important. Afterward, they went to Frost and Ember. Carmen brought out a small cupcake with a candle. James smiled from behind the counter. The other regulars, the people who'd watched this whole story unfold, raised their coffee cups in a silent toast. David, suddenly serious, said, "Do I call her Mom now?" "You can if you want to." Sophie said, "Mom." David said, testing the word, "Mom." He repeated it 3 times like he was learning a new language. Then he smiled, satisfied that it fit. That night, Marcus and Sophie lay in bed and talked about the future, about the house they might buy, about whether there would be more children, about whether David would remember this time as the year his family became complete, or whether he would take it for granted the way children do. Sophie said something that stayed with Marcus. "I used to think confidence meant not needing help. Now I think confidence means asking for what you need, even when people flinch. It means knowing you deserve to exist, even when the world suggests you don't." Marcus thought about all the Sophies in the world who were still waiting for someone to pull out a chair. He thought about all the Marcuses who saw the pain, but were too afraid to stand up. He thought about all the Davids who were learning through watching their parents love without judgment that kindness was not exceptional, but expected. He thought about how one moment changed everything. 3 months later, Sophie published an essay. It was short and honest, and didn't perform inspiration. She wrote about the accident, about the isolation, about learning to live in a world that saw disability as tragedy instead of simply as difference. About Marcus, but not in a way that made him the savior. She wrote about him as a man who saw her, who chose her, who helped her choose herself. The essay was shared more than she expected, not viral in the way videos went viral, but shared in a steady, quiet way that suggested it had touched something true in people. Sophie received messages from disabled people who said thank you for not pretending it was easy. From non-disabled people who said thank you for showing them how to see. From people who said they'd pulled out a chair for someone because they'd read her story and remembered that kindness mattered. Marcus used the essay when he mentored young single parents. He said, "Look, this is what real love looks like. Not perfect, not easy, just chosen again and again." At Frost and Ember, things shifted in ways that were hard to see unless you were looking for them. The cafe became known among a certain community. Not famous, not made into a story about inspiration porn, but quietly known as a place where people were welcome, where a single mother with visible mental health struggles could sit without being judged, where a transgender teenager could exist without whispers, where Marcus and Sophie and David came every Saturday at the second table from the window and modeled what it looked like to make room. One Saturday, a new person walked in. Young on crutches like Sophie, had been scanning the room with that familiar mix of hope and resignation. Carmen watched. Then Carmen stood up and approached the table where the new person was standing. "You're welcome to sit with us," Carmen said. "There's room." Sophie watched from across the cafe and felt something settle in her chest. The cycle had continued. Kindness was spreading like ripples in water, moving outward in ways that were hard to measure, but impossible to deny. That night, Marcus said to Sophie, "You changed the world." And Sophie, who had finally learned to accept this, said, "We changed the world. Both of us. All of us. Everyone who chose to see instead of look away." 5 years later, the story had become part of the fabric of the cafe itself. Marcus and Sophie still came every Saturday with David, who was now 11 and far too cool to admit that he loved the ritual, but did anyway. They sat at the second table from the window. They drank the same drinks they always had. They talked about nothing and everything. But the table itself had become something more. It was a symbol of what was possible when someone pulled out a chair. When someone said, "You're welcome here." When someone saw another person and recognized the simple fact of their humanity. Other children had sat at that table. Other families had been born there. Sophie had started a program in collaboration with James and Carmen to offer free mentoring to young disabled people, teaching them not that they needed fixing, but that they deserved to exist exactly as they were. Marcus had written a book, not about Sophie, though she was in it, about what he'd learned in 6 years of raising a child alone, about grief, about rebuilding, about the specific kind of courage it takes to open your arms to another person's pain. Sophie had completed a master's degree in engineering. She now worked for a company that designed accessibility equipment, and she didn't position herself as inspiration. She was just a woman doing her job, doing it well, refusing the narrative that suggested she was overcoming anything. She was just living. And David, who was becoming a young man with his own dreams and his own struggles and his own understanding of kindness, had written a school essay about family that made his parents cry. He described the moment Sophie joined their table, not as rescue, but as completion. He talked about learning through watching both his parents that love wasn't about fixing people, but about creating space for them to fix themselves. The world hadn't changed. There was still prejudice. There were still people who looked away. There were still systems and structures that made it harder for people with disabilities to exist in public space. There were still mothers who treated their disabled children with pity instead of pride. There were still colleagues who saw kindness as exceptional. But something had shifted. In one cafe, in one neighborhood, in the lives of everyone who'd been there that morning, something had shifted. Kindness had become the rule instead of the exception. Inclusion had become expected instead of remarkable. And it had all started with one moment. One man standing up. One chair being pulled out. One simple sentence. "You're welcome here." Sophie never forgot what it felt like to not be welcome. She held that memory close, not as trauma, but as reference point. She understood that without having experienced being unwelcome, she might never have understood how precious welcome truly was. Marcus never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. He held that memory close, used it to teach his son that the people other people looked away from were often the most important. That kindness wasn't about being good, it was about being human. And David, growing up in a home where love was loud and present and unapologetic, carried that understanding forward into the world. He would grow up to be the kind of man who noticed when someone was being left out, who felt compelled to do something about it, who understood that you could change the world, not through grand gestures, but through showing up again and again for people who needed to know they mattered. The second table from the window at Frost and Ember Café became a kind of legend. People told the story, not in the way you might expect, not with dramatic flourish, but simply. A man was there. A woman came in. He invited her to sit, and everything changed. The story mattered not because it was unique, but because it was possible. It meant that any of them could stand up. Any of them could pull out a chair. Any of them could say, "You're welcome here," and mean it. And in saying it, in meaning it, they could change someone's entire world. Sophie sometimes thought about what would have happened if Marcus had been reading his phone that day. If he'd been checking the news, lost in the small screen, the way everyone was always lost in their screens, unable to notice the people around them. The moment would have passed. Sophie would have been refused. She would have walked out. She would have gone home to her apartment and spiraled further into isolation. She might have recovered, or she might not have. The world would have gone on. Nobody would have known what almost happened. But Marcus wasn't reading his phone. He was present. He was paying attention. He was available in that moment to do the thing that mattered. And that was the final lesson Sophie wanted people to understand. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about martyring yourself to the problem of other people's suffering. It was about being available, being present, being willing to see someone and act on what you saw. She said as much in another essay, and then another, until what started as a moment in a cafe had become a quiet mission to help people understand that kindness wasn't virtue. It was simply paying attention to the people around you and recognizing their humanity. Marcus and Sophie built a life that was ordinary in its best way. They had another child, a daughter who grew up knowing her mother as a woman who worked, who loved, who occasionally got frustrated and angry and didn't perform gratitude for being allowed to exist. They bought a house. They argued and made up and learned slowly how to be married in the way that marriages actually happened, which was messy and difficult and deeply, profoundly worth it. They still went to the cafe every Saturday. The ritual remained. And though neither of them was desperate anymore, though neither of them was invisible anymore, they went because ritual was how you honored something that mattered. Because routine was how you said, "I still remember where I came from." because the second table from the window had become sacred in the way ordinary things sometimes do when they've witnessed extraordinary things. One Saturday years later, a young woman with a prosthetic limb walked into the café. She was alone, nervous, looking for a place to sit. The café was full. A man who'd been there that first day, who'd watched Marcus and Sophie's story unfold, stood up. He didn't think about it. He just stood up and approached the young woman and said, "You're welcome to sit with us. There's room." The young woman sat down. Relief washed across her face. And somewhere in the café, Sophie watched and felt her eyes fill with tears because the cycle had continued. Kindness had been passed forward. The promise had been kept. This is how the world changes, she thought. Not all at once, not dramatically, but through moment after moment after moment of people choosing to see each other, choosing to make room, choosing to say, "You're welcome here." One moment is enough. One chair pulled out is enough. One person choosing not to look away is enough to change someone's entire universe. That is the story of Sophie and Marcus. That is the story of what happened at the second table from the window on a cold Saturday morning in January. That is the story of how one moment echoed forward into years of kindness and belonging, and the quiet revolution of treating each other like we deserved to exist. The snow is falling again. It always does. And in a warm cafe in the city, a family sits at a familiar table holding space for each other, holding space for the people around them, reminding everyone who sees them that this is what love looks like. Not perfect, not easy, just chosen again and again until chosen becomes simply what you do. You're welcome here. Those 4 words, they changed everything. And they can change everything again in the next moment, in the next cafe, in the next room, if someone is willing to stand up and say them and mean them with their whole heart.